Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd also like to welcome the witnesses and thank them for joining us today for this important hearing. In the initial days and months of the COVID pandemic, uncertainty was rampant and much of the economy was locked down. Congress acted multiple times in a bipartisan way to deliver much-needed relief as fast as we could to help save as many jobs as we could. We knew keeping people employed was the best way to keep our economy from crashing. Perhaps the most significant program was the Paycheck Protection Program, known as PPP. Initially, Congress gave the new program $349 billion in March of 2020 and mandated that the Small Business Administration implement the program within 15 days of enacting this new program. Over time, the program received more than $800 billion, and the SBA estimates that it saved more than 51 million jobs. That's right. President Trump worked with Democrats and Republicans in Congress to pass a program at the beginning of a global pandemic that saved more than 51 million jobs and turned it around at rapid pace. Using loan data as of August 2020, the SBA Office of Inspector General has flagged an estimated $4.6 billion, which represents roughly 0.5% of the total loan funding for potential fraud or other improper payments. Now, fraud of any kind is wrong, but given the size of the program and the demands placed on the agency by Congress to rush the money out of the door to save as many jobs as possible, about 0.5% is better than most federal programs that have been around for decades. Sadly, despite this fact, Democrats have continued their effort to undermine the PPP's success by attacking the Trump administration and financial institutions involved in the program, despite the PPP's well-documented successes. In stark contrast to PPP is the Enhanced Unemployment Insurance Program. The Labor Department's Office of Inspector General estimates an improper payment rate of 18.7% in 2021. That means about $163 billion, $163 billion of the program's $872 billion in federal state unemployment benefits paid during the pandemic could have been improperly paid, with a significant portion attributable to fraud. The OIG found that, quote, based on their audit and investigative work, the improper payment rate for the pandemic UI program is likely higher than 18.71%. Why aren't we having a hearing on that? Great, let's go after the $4 billion, but why aren't we going after the $163 billion that's being completely ignored in fraud? There are numerous examples of domestic UI fraud. One man from New York received $1.5 million over 10 months, and a California real estate broker got more than $500,000 over 6 months. One person used the same Social Security number to file UI claims in 40 different states. We're not having a hearing on this. In addition, the program was targeted by criminal organizations and enemy nation states. A ProPublica investigation found that a substantial amount of UI fraud can be attributed to organized crime, both in the United States and abroad. Estimates by some say at least 70% of the money stolen ultimately went to foreign nationals in countries like China, Russia, and Nigeria. One state received fake unemployment claims that came from IP addresses in nearly 170 different countries. That was just one state's reported fraud. So far, just over $4 billion has been recovered of that $160+ billion in fraud from the Enhanced UI program. We should be doing everything we can to aggressively identify, investigate, and prosecute the criminal fraud in pandemic unemployment programs. That's why I introduced a bill last week with many of my fellow Republican colleagues to help encourage states to recover fraudulent payments. I hope we will be able to get that bill moved through Congress quickly. On top of the egregious and unprecedented fraud, The pandemic's enhanced UI program has been cited as a leading contributor to the historically high inflation that is crushing American families right now. With all the legislative extensions, some claimants could receive up to 79 weeks of enhanced unemployment, about a year and a half of getting paid more money not to work than what they were making at their job. And all this while businesses all across the country are still looking for workers. You had the government paying hundreds of billions of dollars to pay people more money not to work than they were working prior to the pandemic. Democrats insisted on extending the program for another 6 months and providing an additional $300 a week in their partisan $1.9 trillion spending spree that caused the highest inflation in 40 years. The latest numbers have inflation hitting 8.6% last month. This is costing the average American household an additional $327 a month. That's right, families across America are paying over $300 a month more in higher inflation because of all the trillions of dollars in spending here in Washington doing things like paying people not to work. Washington Democrats shamelessly used the pandemic to pursue their socialist dreams of government dependency. They paid people not to work, handed out big stimulus checks, and expanded government welfare programs, all while ignoring the warnings about inflation that would be caused. Instead of dumping cash into the already recovering economy, we should have been focused on reopening schools and getting our businesses back open safely and helping those workers get back into their jobs. While PPP and other pandemic programs have a few detractors, they were overwhelmingly bipartisan and largely succeeded in delivering much-needed relief and, again, saving 51 million jobs for those hardworking families who are luckily still in the workforce today because of this program. I hope that in our oversight of pandemic programs, my Democrat colleagues will be able to recognize the difference between what was needed to save the economy during an unprecedented pandemic versus pushing a partisan inflation-inducing agenda. With that, again, look forward to hearing from our witnesses. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scalise. I would now like to introduce our distinguished witnesses. The Honorable Michael Horowitz is the Inspector General for the Department of Justice and chairs the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. Inspector General Horowitz testified before this committee last March, and we appreciate his return.